Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know, I'm Dane Kerner, the Executive Director of the Center for Science, Technology, and Society here at Santa Clara University, one of our 3 centers of distinction that embody our mission to create a more just, humane, and sustainable world. And we're delighted to welcome you here today to our Energy for All panel, which is actually, in some ways, part of a course that Keith Warner, our Director of Education, and I are teaching this quarter entitled Technology for Social Justice, which is an honors course, and so we're glad to have all the students from that course here. We are going to start this afternoon with a presentation on business models for addressing energy poverty from Professor Jim Cook and Professor Sanjay Jain. Jim Cook is actually the founder of the Center for Science, Technology, and Society in 1997, one of the founders of the Tech Awards program in partnership with the Tech Museum of Innovation in San Jose, and the founding director of the GSBI, along with Eric Carlson and several others. So we're delighted to have Jim Cook here. He has previously been Dean of the Business School, Dean of the Engineering School, President of the United States, not yet. But Jim has worn many hats here, and he's currently a full professor at the Bill and Jan Terry Professor of Management in the Lee School of Business. I'm delighted to have Jim. And Sanjay Jain, his partner in this research, is an assistant professor of management who studies technology and energy poverty with an eye towards social justice. So Sanjay will start the presentation. After Jim and Sanjay are done presenting, we're delighted to have Lesley Silverthorn from the GSBI class of 2011, CEO of Angaza Design, who will talk about her innovations, and then we'll open it up for Q&A around 6 o'clock. So I think at this point I'm turning it over to Dr. Jain. Sanjay, thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dane, and thanks for all coming at 5 o'clock. I guess for some of you it is class, but those of you who did, or those of you who are coming otherwise, thanks for coming at this time, taking time out. So what I'll do is actually present the first half of some work that Jim and I have been working on now for almost about, I would say, close to a year, and we continue to kind of work on this research project. So I'll kind of guide you through some of what we've been doing, and Jim will actually tell you all the fun stuff about the companies that we've been profiling as part of our research. So the title, of course, of the session is Energy for All. Thanks to Keith, and let me. Right. So the kind of larger premise of this particular project was the fact that how do we actually, I mean, most of the products and services that are created really for 1 billion of the population of this planet. And so the big issue that I think people in the field of social entrepreneurship have been exploring now for the last decade or so is how do we create products and services for the next 4 billion? If we have 5 billion and counting on this planet, how do we actually create products and services that go to these underserved kinds of communities? Okay, and so part of the issue then is we've seen markets, of course, being created in Silicon Valley and in other developed economies, but how do we create a similar set of markets for these underserved communities? So within that larger kind of space, we are interested in the issue of provision of energy. Okay, and the statistics on this front are quite mind-boggling, actually. At some level, we have to consider ourselves really fortunate. We have energy 24/7, and we almost take it for granted. And every once in a while, when PG&E cuts off the power for maybe 5 minutes, we start grumbling. But think about the fact that close to half the world's population does not have a continuous source of energy. Okay, there's about 1.5 billion people who are off the grid, so they don't have any kind of form of centralized grid kind of coming and supplying them with electricity. A number of other people who have an energy solution have an inefficient energy solution in terms of the use of kerosene and diesel and old technologies, brown technologies. And then there's a whole bunch of folks who have some amount of energy, but it's not on a continuous basis. So when I talk to my parents in India on a weekly basis, I find out that power was cut for an hour or 2 hours. And so at home in Bangalore, in India, we have a backup power supply to kind of make up for the times when we cannot Skype with one another because regular power supply has gone off. So it's a pretty massive kind of issue outside of Silicon Valley and outside of the United States. And so the question really is, and if we, the provision of energy is also very interesting because it has multiplier economic effects. If you can provide energy to these communities, they can start doing more productive forms of work that can then make them a lot more sustainable in terms of their lifestyles and so forth. Okay, it can bring a certain amount of financial stability to their lives in terms of their productivity, in terms of their ability to have a decent income, and hence lead a much better life than they currently are. Okay, so in that sense, solving the problem of energy poverty, which is kind of what this session is all about, is a very big deal, and hopefully some of you will kind of pick up on the severity of the problem, and we talk a little bit about some solutions that have started to kind of emerge for this. So if you think about it, what I'm trying to list out here are some of the constraints that exist out there. Why is it difficult to provide energy to these 4 billion people, or to the 1.5 billion people off the grid? And so I've tried to kind of list some of the reasons for why this has been problematic, why the markets out here are not necessarily very efficient at this point in time. For one, there are, as it turns out, incentives for brown technologies in some of these countries. And so there are incentives for using kerosene and diesel and not necessarily using a more clean solution. Okay? Then clearly, one big issue out here, which you face whenever you talk about any kind of social entrepreneurship venture, is the ability of people in these communities to actually pay on a continual basis. Okay, so they have very severely limited incomes. We're talking, in many cases, less than $2 a day, and their ability to raise debt, to say buy any kind of capital equipment is also limited. Okay. From a producer viewpoint, the problem is that there aren't enough skilled staff to actually run the equipment in some of these villages and communities. Okay. So even if you did get a solution out there, the ability to actually run this on an ongoing basis is problematic. So you need to actually engage in training and education so that people can run the energy solutions that we would actually kind of provide. Okay. From the government's point of view, till very recently, the costs of extending the grid to some of these communities is actually quite prohibitive. So in many cases, they're living in areas that are remote, and so actually taking the grid across does not necessarily make sense from the government's point of view. Okay? And again, that's kind of a peculiar thing, but that happens a lot. But from a enabler viewpoint, what's been happening is we know that over the last couple of decades, there's been a growing interest in clean technologies, both in the developed world as well as in developing countries. In the developed world, we're really talking about solutions such as solar, biofuels, and wind as kind of being the next generation of clean technologies that will hopefully over a period of time start to begin to replace or complement oil, natural gas, and so forth. And at the kind of bottom of the pyramid, or for these underserved communities, one of the interesting issues is if they have not had an energy solution it probably makes more sense to start with a clean solution as opposed to a kind of a polluted solution, so to speak, in terms of kerosene or natural gas. So can we get them started off on sources of power that come from renewable energy such as solar and wind and so forth? Okay? And in many of these developing countries, the government policy is slowly beginning to turn around to the point that they have mandates and incentives for production of some amount of clean energy. So in India, my understanding is that by the year 2020, they want to have 15% of all energy produced in India coming out of clean sources. So like this, there are incentives in various countries that are now beginning to make clean energy solutions more kind of economically viable. Okay? So how does this tie into things that have been happening at Santa Clara? So for the last decade, the GSBI has been inviting about 20 or 25 entrepreneurs to come in the summer and spend a couple of weeks and learn more about business. And increasingly, the focus within the GSBI has been on entrepreneurs that are working in the clean energy space, that are providing solutions, clean energy solutions to some of these underserved communities. And so at this point in time, we have a database which is known as the Energy Map, which is probably something that a lot of you have been exposed to. And we have over 40 companies, and it's a growing kind of list, because this year, for example, 10 more companies or 10 more enterprises that are in this clean energy space are going to go through the GSBI. So this has become a focus area at Santa Clara, and so we kind of wanted to start to get to know more about some of these companies. Okay? And so our focus is on startups as opposed to the large companies that are interested in providing these clean energy solutions. Okay? And in terms of the methodology that we're using, we're really kind of focused on developing detailed case studies of ventures that are in this space. And we've selected a total of 5 different ventures for the start. So we've got 2 ventures that are based in Africa, Africa Biofuels, and AEDC, and we've got 3 ventures that are based in India, Avani, Cellco, and Huspar Systems. All of these companies, all of these ventures have gone through the GSBI in the past, and so using the information that was collected as part of their being part of the GSBI competition, the forms that they filled to enter, to get into the GSBI cohort, the forms that they filled as part of being in the program are all pieces of information that we're using in order to kind of understand these organizations a lot deeper. Also, I mean, we've been spending a lot of time interviewing the kind of owners and the founders of these ventures on a continuing basis, because creating ventures in this space is not easy, especially if you're trying to do it in some kind of an economically viable form. In some cases, you might get grants upfront, and those grants will last for a little while, but then the money kind of runs out, and as a consequence, these companies kind of start to go under. More recently, the interest has really been in terms of actually developing viable economic models or business models, such that these companies can run on their own accord, that they don't have to necessarily rely on grant money and so forth, donations and so forth, but just on the basis of their operations itself, they can kind of actually be kind of ongoing ventures. Okay? And so, as a consequence, in many cases, these companies get started with a certain model, but very quickly the owners and the founders realize that they might have to do something else in order to remain viable. And so we've been trying to track these companies over a period of time, interviewing the founders, say every 6 months or so, to kind of understand what fine-tuning they're doing to their business models in order to keep afloat, or in some cases actually do really well. Okay? So I'll end up my part by just talking about how we're organizing all the information that we're collecting about these ventures. we really kind of focused in on 3 separate areas. In some sense, what we're saying is that the business model is part of a larger solution that these ventures are trying to create within these communities. And those, at least 3 key elements of the solution that they're creating are the technology that they're using. So we're very interested in understanding, what is the material system, how are they going about actually providing a clean energy solution to these communities. Do they source locally? Do they source globally? How do they develop, underlying technology and then kind of put it into the field? Okay, so that set of issues is what we kind of cover under technology. Okay. Second is, okay, you've got the technology, put up, you've got the plant put up, but you need to have, in some ways, a business model such that you have an ongoing, sustainable financial operation coming out of the provision of that energy. Okay, so boiled down in terms of business, what are the revenue streams that are coming in from the presence of that particular plant in a particular community, and what are the costs of running that particular operation, and hopefully revenues are larger than costs so that the business model can be viable in some kind of way. And you'll see that, and Jim will probably talk a little bit about this, the kinds of business models that these companies tend to come up with are very inventive and very different from what we have come to expect, in a more westernized kind of context. They really are trying to figure out all kinds of ways in which they can kind of, obtain revenues in some kind of way, and it often is, the energy solution itself is only part of the revenue stream. They have multiple revenue streams that are kind of coming out. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that. But part of the interest is really in understanding the underlying business model. How are they actually going to be an ongoing, sustainable, financially viable social venture in the community and the communities that they are part of. And third, because they are operating in these regions that are very resource constrained, they often have to rely on a whole host of partners, in order to have an ongoing venture. Partly they have to, in order to even understand the communities that they're working in, they have to kind of develop relationships with NGOs, with institutions that already exist within these communities, in order to be able to kind of understand, what the issues are and what the existing, customs and norms are within the community, so that they can provide some kind of a solution that's tailored, to the community. They have to often deal with the government, and so that's always an interesting one in terms of, whether they deal with the government or in some ways they figure out that they don't want to get too involved with the government if the government is perceived as, for example, being somewhat corrupt. But the question really is, which are the set of partners that they kind of develop relationships with and nurture over a period of time so that they can provide a solution that's fairly sustainable in these areas. Okay, with that, I'll pass it on to Jim, and we'll talk about 2 of the cases that we've been studying carefully.
We divided it this way because Sanjay's off to teach an MBA class. Sanjay's the theoretician, I'm the practitioner, so we're going to talk about his practice theory, theory that evolves out of lots and lots of practice. So the work of the last decade of the GSBI and a lot of the work of the center, I think, is really focused on learning by doing, and it's probably what many of you will do in your careers, you'll learn by doing. So, but I'm going to build on some, advance this the proper way here. The context or the framework that Sanjay mentioned. Cellco is a tech award winner. Harish Handy, I think, is a PhD from, I want to say, University of Massachusetts. And he's addressing this market of, that you see anywhere 1.4 to 1.6 billion people who are off the grid. And his focus is in India, primarily in rural India. His solution, his technology solution, is a solar electric lighting system for areas that are lacking access to electricity. Now, mind you, if you go into rural India, it's not only that there's no grid, there's no the whole infrastructure has to be created. So you have a working technology. How do you get it to market? So he's had to actually create 25 distribution centers, and they supply the technology. They actually have to provide access to finance. Because if you get down further on this slide, about $400 for a house, that's if you're living on $2 a day for a whole household in many cases, for a whole household, $60 a month, $600, $720 a year. Say, well, how are you going to afford, where you're going to have $400 sitting around to buy one of these solar home systems? How are you going to crack that nut? So he has to also be in the finance business. He also has to be in the service business. These things don't keep operating, solar cells. You've got to clean them. There's maintenance activity and so forth that's associated with them. And in order to create a market, you've got to go like the door-to-door salesman. You've actually got to do a home kind of custom design solution for a particular homeowner. It's a kind of a one-to-one selling kind of proposition. So in order to create this market, you also had to work with rural banks and leasing companies and microfinance organizations that could provide access to this capital that was needed in order to purchase a solar home system. These data are a couple of years old now because what's happening with the price of solar panels? If you look at the bottom here, between 2010 and 2012, the cost per watt of a solar panel has dropped from $1.75 to 90 cents. That's just in 3 years. That's phenomenal. And by the end of this year, venture capitalists tell me it'll be less than 60 cents. In fact, I heard a report yesterday that there's somebody in the valley working on a 40 cents per watt for solar panels. So there's that old symbol for crisis in the Chinese character, danger. A lot of companies are losing money. Opportunity, there are a lot of poor people for whom that phenomenon is nirvana, because all of a sudden it's conceivable to think of solutions that are economically acceptable. So the way he does this in the model was you have 20% down, so you'd have to come up with $80, and you may do that through a loan, a microloan. And then over 4 years, you'd pay at a rate of $10 to $12 a month. Now it's lower now because of the unit costs coming down, but that $10 to $12 was comparable or competitive with what you might be paying for kerosene for the similar amount of lighting. So what you see is that what you're competing against here is non-consumption, and you're competing with a market that is now purchasing kerosene. So you've got to displace that existing market with an alternative solution. So here's how Cellco is structured. They actually have to do R&D. They have to do research and development. As I mentioned, they've set up these service centers, and they've got regional branches. These are their revenue streams. They sell products to households. They have over 100,000 sales, as of a year ago. They also have, though, in order to create that market, they work through NGOs. You all, if you're taking the course with Thane, and you're probably familiar with the phrase NGO, non-governmental organization. But why are non-governmental organizations there? Because people don't trust the government. They're on the ground. They're providing essential services now. And so they work through self-help groups to educate the market. And self-help groups are actually a way of mitigating risk. If you're familiar with the Grameen Bank story, these self-help groups are a way of through collective lending processes, creating a high propensity. If you've seen Eunice's work, it's a 98+% repayment rate. So in a sense, this is a solution that not only takes advantage of technology, but also takes advantage of local customs and culture. They also have a licensing stream of revenues, and they have royalties and franchise fees from independently owned franchises, and they're earning carbon credit offsets, so they monetize the reduction in carbon. To reduce their cost of R&D, they work with universities and international NGOs and volunteers, and they actually are able to attract grants to fund some of the basic R&D work. So in a sense, you see some hybrid aspects of this. If you were IBM or General Electric, you wouldn't have that kind of opportunity to do that. Very, very inventive business model, and growing very, very rapidly. This model is also has catalyzed development, so you're starting to see more and more solar home system solutions crop up in India. Another one, I just had lunch on Sunday with Manoj Sinjay, is Huspower Systems. This is actually going from a household solution to a community scale solution. 125,000 villages that are off the grid in India. It's about 480 million. It's almost a third of the global market off the grid. And the solution is in taking rice husk waste and actually creating through gasifier technology. Dane has visited this location and seen this, but and the target market is potentially where this solution would work at 145,000 villages. So it's a big market. And the latest data I had from having lunch Sunday with Manoj was that these things are cash flow break even on an operating basis within about 18 months now. So they've actually perfected the model. They have 90 of these now in India, and they're expanding to Tanzania. And we'll be working with the Global Social Benefit Incubator mentors to look at how they can replicate this in Tanzania. I think you've seen this, if you've seen Dane's slide, I was actually walking out there and I said, oh gosh, he's still in my thunder because I saw this on your screen, but there is a couple things I would point out that I'm sure you've been in class and you've seen this, but the two things I would point out is this little thing right here, this meter, which is how do you ensure collections and avoid theft is a kind of a low-cost prepayment. I think they got this down to about $5 or something to make one of those. And the other thing that's not in this slide that Manoj was presenting back at Yale on Sunday when I connected with him, there's a revenue stream that comes here now from incense. They actually take the rice husk waste and make incense with it, which creates a lot of jobs in the local economy. And then they also now monetize the carbon credits. So he's got a revenue stream now showing coming from reducing the carbon emissions through this solution. So 90 plants, cash flow positive from operations, achieving organic growth. They've raised about $8 million in the last year to actually accelerate the growth of this because there's a capital expenditure to develop the plants and they need that upfront capital. Another success story. So I want to move quickly through 4 kind of key processes that we've seen and then maybe share with you some highlights of what might be a practice theory, if you will, a theory that comes out of studying a lot of organizations. One thing you'll see in this space is it's really a contact sport. It's a lot of localized solutions. It's not in Schenectady, New York, at General Electric labs, if you will, that these solutions are being developed. The solution is focused on micro-provision. Why? Because as you'll hear from Lesley, Silverthorn is what's being replaced often are lanterns. These are kind of quaint with these kerosene lanterns, but they're also, if you're in a small household situation, really very destructive from a breathing perspective. They're based on first-hand market intelligence. Generally, if any of you are in business school, Gartner Group and Forrester and some of these groups that do market research, nobody does market research on the poor people of the planet. So there's this huge void of market intelligence. So Sanjay mentioned 4 billion people. Guess what? We don't know much about them. And much of what is taught in conventional business schools says they don't count because they don't have money. And so, in a sense, this is a very disruptive kind of effort to say, no, 4 billion people is a lot of people. Bottom 1 or 2 or 3 billion is terribly, terribly important. By the way, that's the part of the world population that's growing, and the stuff that they're using now for energy is massively polluting. It's causing deforestation, all kinds of things. So, we're all kind of touched by this and living in the same kind of global context. But what's also happening here is that not only is stuff developing locally, like the labs are in the field, but there also is the case that you have to scope technology globally, because I showed you what's happening with solar panel costs. So you can't afford to just be local, you've got to also be global in your perspective. The business models are focused on unit economics. And I think in a most simplified way, it means that your business model is not going to work unless it creates some kind of economic surplus, and it makes it's affordable for the poorest of the poor, if you will, at that level. So a lot of the work in the GSBI really does focus on how to make the unit economics. How do you make this work at the level of the individual user or household? Make it affordable. And how do you create an economic buyer? Maybe you've got to provide access to, you have to have a lease-to-own model or something like that. So in a sense, this is an alternative way of thinking about enterprise development, serving the base of the pyramid. To make a go of this, you saw multiple revenue streams, like with Cellco, all these different sources of revenue that are generated through licensing and so forth, and with Huspower through incense, et cetera, and carbon credits. One of the key things also is access to the right kind of capital. Manoj, when he presented a couple days ago, he says the financing side is really critical because you've got to get the right kind of capital. You can't get commercially focused venture capital that you see in Silicon Valley. You need below market rate capital. You need very patient capital because to develop these markets initially takes a long time. This report, just sharing with Thane earlier, I read on the airplane coming up, just came out. It's April 2012. From blueprint to scale, it focuses on 3 success stories, all graduates of the GSBI, Huspower, Vision Spring, and IDE, a low-cost drip irrigation solution in India. All are economically viable, but they took a long time to get there, and they've had a lot of trial and error learning and tweaking in their business models to get there. The economic side is really key, and the capital has to be the right kind of capital. Finally, the 2 other items I mentioned is the embedding in the local ecosystem, establishing legitimacy. You're working up against a cartel, if you will, in terms of the current supply chains that exist for lanterns and so forth. So you've got to really overcome that. Building trust and empowerment, upgrading the skill system. Huspower has a Huspower University now. They actually have to train their own, all of their own workforce because people don't have the basic skills to maintain these plants. Values-driven leadership. I think the thing that's common and what I love about this work is the entrepreneurs themselves. They are so passionate about their work, they are so persistent, and they're so imaginative about coming up with solutions. As a group, it's a very, very unique group. They're entrepreneurs, but they're also entrepreneurs with a tremendous, tremendous heart. So pulling all this together, there are 3 functional mechanisms you'd have to say exist in probably any successful base of the pyramid venture. One is you've got to figure out how to create value for underserved markets. Second, you have to do it at a very, very low cost, extreme affordability. And thirdly, you've got to figure out how you're going to penetrate that market. How are you going to get to volume? And then the 3 areas that Sanjay and I have looked at on localizing technology, establishing business models, and interfacing with ecosystems. These are all areas where, as a decision maker, if you were a social entrepreneur trying to attack these markets, you'd have to address trade-offs in each one of those areas. And in a sense, then, what's in the cells, things like empathy, extreme affordability, unit economics, crossing the chasm, partnering, and so forth, those are a set of practices or processes that you would see across many, many ventures in the base of the pyramid market. So this is sort of the crude, if you will, beginning of a theory for attacking the base of the pyramid markets. And so that leaves me with my final slide, which is, when you think about work in this area, is small beautiful? You know, we have this munificent environment with massive amounts of light. We have computers that consume 120 watts of energy. Classmates do only use 5 watts, classmate computer. So there maybe we have something to learn from this kind of small is beautiful perspective, if you will, that's more adaptive for us at the top of the pyramid. You know, it's more concerned about preserving the environment, it's more concerned about efficiency and lowering costs and making everybody have a chance to play. Another question I find myself thinking about, are these entrepreneurs technologists? Or are they managers? Or are they really architects? If you look at all the moving parts, in a sense, they're architects as much as anything in order to be successful. Thirdly, what is the ultimate creation? Is it the product or is it the organization? If you look at the Cellco example, if you look at Huspower, is the product really the creation, or is it that they're really creating an organization that can do this? Are they lucky? Is that what it takes to be successful doing this stuff? Or are they really persistent? There's a phrase in Silicon Valley, though, walking dead. It's ventures that continue to sort of bump along. They're not going to be the Google, they're not going to go public, but they continue to bump along, and they're economically viable, but they're not really going anyplace. They're the walking dead. Some of the most stimulating, inspiring people I know are social entrepreneurs who in Silicon Valley would be considered walking dead because they're willing to stay at it for not 5 to 6 years like you would in Silicon Valley. They're in it for 10 to 12 years or 15 years before they figure out how all the pieces all the tumblers have to fall into place to unlock the opportunity. And then what are the principles, processes, and mechanisms that will enable these organizations to thrive? I think that's something we all need to figure out. And I think Santa Clara University, in many respects, it's interesting, all three of the success stories in this just completed report are right out of the Santa Clara University Global Social Benefit Incubator. So I think we have to stay humble because we're early stage and trying to learn as we go here, but I think it's very, very promising. On the energy map, by the way, Sanjay mentioned 40 ventures, it's now 52. And we have 8 new ones coming in, so it's actually 60 ventures. So our knowledge base in this area will continue to grow. So thank you very much. It's been great. I get the privilege of introducing Lesley Silverthorn, who's Fame mentions the class of 2011. And my last conversation before leaving the graduation of the day he presented, Lesley, was with Callahan, and I don't know if I told you this, but he was carrying 2 of Lesley's lights, and he sat out on the quad over there with my wife and I, and he said, "This is so cool, I'm going to take this back and I'm going to sell it through my eHealth Point stores." He just loves what Lesley has done here. And Lesley has a background, I think, including at Apple Computer as well as at Stanford and the D-Lab, and it's a master's degree in mechanical, is that right?
Mechanical engineering.
Mechanical engineering. I knew that part too. So thank you for being here. Look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. So what I'm going to do today is tell you a little bit about myself and how I actually got into social entrepreneurship, and then take you through a very photographic journey of Angaza Design, my company, and kind of where we were in the early stages and how we got to where we are today. So I actually went to school right on the street at Stanford, did my undergrad in product design, which is sort of a mixture between mechanical engineering and a little more fuzzy psychology and art, and really trying to understand how you design products directly from a customer's needs rather than designing a product and then pushing it on a certain market or customer. Then I stayed on for grad school there in mechanical engineering. And I actually worked, my couple of first internships and jobs were dealing with large-scale consumer electronics in the US. So I worked on the first 3 generations of the Amazon Kindle, which is very different from anything I'm doing now. But it's interesting because there's a lot of overlap. For example, at Lab 126, which is actually in Cupertino, I was working on a solar bookcase for the Amazon Kindle. And in the US, on a consumer level, solar tends to be very trendy. You know, having I'm sure you've seen the solar messenger bags or backpacks. But we were kind of going on that trend of having a solar bookcase for the Kindle. And I've also worked on medical products, medical processes, a wide range of US-focused products. And what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about the design process. That's basically the same throughout any kind of product or service you're designing, and how we use that design process to actually get to this light we have here and get to a technology that we've developed at Angaza. So Angaza is a for-profit social venture. We're focused on off-grid energy access in East Africa. We actually came out in our very early stages out of the design school at Stanford in a course called Entrepreneurial Design for Extreme Affordability. And that's all about creating products for the base of the pyramid and looking, as you mentioned, at the entire ecosystem of what it takes to bring a product to market. So you've probably seen this picture before, the world at night. And again, 1.2 to 1.6 billion, no one quite knows this number of people globally living without access to reliable electricity. But 10% of that global population is in East Africa. East Africa is primarily Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and this is where we're working. So, and again, I'm going to take you through a lot of stories, pretty much with customers that we've interacted with and created our products based on the inspiration that we had with them. So this is a 14-year-old girl named Naomi in a rural village in northwestern Tanzania. And every night, she was the most diligent student I have ever heard of. She would, at the same time every night, sit down for 2.5 hours and study by the lantern, her kerosene lantern. And this picture is actually not representative of what it usually is like, because usually her and her 3 siblings are all huddled around this one kerosene lantern to study every night. And her family is spending over 30% of their income just to buy that kerosene fuel. Let's pause on that. That is an enormous amount of precious income spent just on the kerosene fuel to light this lantern. And this lantern isn't great light, it's very dim. It outputs extremely toxic fumes, which are equivalent to smoking 2 packs of cigarettes each night. And this is their only option for light that they have after the sun goes down. This is actually in a different village in Tanzania called Ngacho. And I absolutely love this photo because this shows the pride that customers in East Africa, this is in the middle of nowhere, mind you, rural East Africa. It just shows the pride that they have in their cell phone. And their cell phone is usually the only electronic device that they own in rural East Africa, but they really rely on it for everything. So they rely on it for maybe talking to family members who have moved away to the urban areas and are earning money and sending it back. They're beginning to rely on it for health resources. There's a lot of SMS-based health applications that are being mediated through just those Nokia brick dumb phones, as we call them here. Mobile money is a term you might have heard of. And Pesa in Kenya is the base example of mobile money. But mobile money is essentially the ability for customers to send money to anyone or a business via just a simple SMS text message. So there's a lot of very interesting initiatives happening just around the cell phone, because the cell phone is becoming so ubiquitous in these markets. And one of the things we learned along our journey was we actually started just looking at light, and it became very apparent that oftentimes customers value being able to charge their cell phone over light, which is not quite intuitive, if you think of it from a U.S. perspective. And so Tanzania is 85% without grid access. They mostly live in the rural areas, and about 60% of the Tanzanian population has a cell phone. So you can see the dichotomy there between all these people living off grid with very limited options of charging their cell phone. And I'll get into how they do charge their cell phone now. So one important things in looking at the business model of what we're doing and what many social ventures in this space are doing is looking at the unit economics. And we really needed to understand a family's cash flow to understand what they were spending on energy, what kinds of energy they were spending money on, and how we could basically translate that already existing user behavior to our product. So you can see on the left there, they're spending about $1 to $2 per week on 1 liter of kerosene. So that equates to about $75 a year. And on the right, they're spending about 25 to 50 cents on a cell phone charge, about 6 charges per month. And this may require them walking over 2 hours to the nearest town where there's a source of electricity to charge it, or they may, there's actually a lot of local entrepreneurs basically up and coming in the rural villages that have some sort of solar setup or generator and are actually making money off of charging their neighbors' cell phones. So if you look at the total 5-year cost that customers are now spending on their energy needs, it's about $500. And that's enormous for someone living off of $2 a day. And I'm going to come back to that again to kind of show you how we're looking at the unit economics in terms of what we're doing. Oh, sorry about the bottom there. Mac PC compatibility issue, but So the human-centered design process is something that I was trained in, and something that in forming Angaza, my co-founder and I decided to keep at the forefront of our mission and make sure that we were always coming back to this, what we call human-centered design process, to make sure that we were designing actual appropriate products for the markets. And the process starts with a stage called observation and empathy. And then from those observations and empathy developing exercises, say, you define a need. And you use that need to basically influence what you're designing. So I'm going to take you through some of the ways that we actually go into these villages, observe our customers, empathize with them, and get to that need. So this is a typical rural village. This is also in Tanzania. It's pretty spread out in the middle of nowhere. There's this is a city center, well, not city, village center, as we could say. And then all the houses are really spread out from that. So we would walk easily about 30 minutes to a house to visit with the family. This is Omai, and we actually had a great just 4 hours about sitting in a little village, a little kitchen hut with no windows, no ventilation. You've got the fire burning there, which is what she's cooking on. She's also got her kerosene lantern running. And again, you think back to that picture of Naomi, which was smoking 2 packs of cigarettes per day from the kerosene fumes. You couple the fire and the kerosene lantern and a very small space, and this is what basically the women are breathing in every day, 3 times a day when they cook. And one story that happened when we were visiting Hawaii is she was trying to teach us Swahili, and I'm really bad at Swahili. And she was saying nombe, which is the word for cow, and I just couldn't pronounce it. She was just like in hysterical laughter. And she pulls out her cell phone and types it on the screen of her cell phone. She's like, see, like this is how you spell it. Like, why can't you pronounce it? And at that moment I was like, well, we're sitting in this hut with no ventilation, like, trying to see by kerosene lantern, and she's got a cell phone. Like, there's something going on here. Technology's taking over these rural markets, but there's kind of a catch-up that's happening with meeting the energy needs of those technology products, and then introducing clean energy products that can completely replace kerosene. So that was kind of a funny anecdote I wanted to share. I guess let's see about this. So I mentioned that local entrepreneurs were popping up in these rural villages, and oftentimes they tended to be barbers. I don't know why, but barbers basically had a side job of charging all their neighbors' cell phones. So you can see here in the bottom this mess of wires. He actually has a solar panel up there, which he installs. He goes out twice a day and rotates it to face towards the sun to basically maximize his energy output. And he charges his cell phones off of this mess of wires. And again, customers are paying between 20 and 50 cents for one cell phone charge. This is another completely different village, another barber who had set up a cell phone charging business. And it looks completely, what's happening here. But basically, also, this was a solar panel setup too without a battery. And so customers would have to leave their cell phone there during the day, which means if they were charging it 1 or 2 times a week, they'd be without their cell phone for 1 or 2 days a week too. And one thing to note here, it's really interesting, but telecom companies in East Africa are very big players in this market. And there's a lot of private companies basically vying for the rural market share within East Africa. And so telecom companies are really starting to look at clean energy solutions, both microgrid or distributed solar like we're working in, as a way for them to ensure their customers are keeping their cell phones charged, which means they use more airtime, which means more revenue for the telecom companies. So it's really interesting because they're starting to get into the solar industry as a way to drive revenue back to them. It also means that customers use more mobile money. They get transaction fees off of each mobile money transaction, more revenue for the telecom company. So this was actually one of the larger solar home systems. This is very similar to what Cellco in India does. They usually have 1 or 2 big lead-acid car batteries, a large solar panel on the roof, and it runs fluorescent tube lighting like this, or CFLs. And this looks great, except this customer actually installed that system at the time we were there 2 years before that, and within 8 months it had stopped working, and it just sat completely stagnant in his house. So this is an example of something that a customer spends a very large down payment to buy a product like this, but if there's no servicing and they don't understand how to fix a product like this, if something goes wrong, then it's basically a waste of money, and the potential that solar home system like this can bring to a family is completely erased. And in this case, we really suspected it was just the batteries were used batteries. They were already, they had been charged and discharged so much that simply replacing the battery could have made his whole solar home system actually live and active again. But again, it had been several years since he was able to use it. So we kind of use that approach. We've traveled all over East Africa, in rural villages, one-on-one conversations with customers, more bigger sort of interactions with villagers, like the photo on the right I showed you. And we took a mixture of basically talking to our customers, trying to understand what they were verbally telling us of what they needed, and then trying to reach our own conclusions based on what we observed, because oftentimes there's a very big disconnect between what the customers are telling you they want and they need and what they actually want and need, or what they can actually afford. So there's a lot of work in actually reconciling those two to get to a product or a solution. And then our next step was actually taking everything we learned from all of this user research and boiling it down, boiling it down to a need, brainstorming off of that need, and coming up with prototypes, physical, real prototypes to give back to those customers, to have them test the prototype, give us feedback, and it's really us testing a lot of assumptions around what we thought. So, don't laugh. These are some very early prototypes that we, about 3 years ago, started out with. And at that point, we were looking at these micro solar concentrators, which would essentially use a lens or a mirrored parabolic surface to reflect a greater amount of sun on a smaller amount of solar panels. So it's a way to actually reduce the cost per watt of solar panels. We have since completely abandoned this idea because, as we talked about before, solar panel prices are coming down very quickly. So the price viability of a micro solar concentrator like this just doesn't make much sense anymore. But this is a good example of us just building some quick and dirty prototypes, which we brought then back to East Africa. We're testing with a lot of the same customers we had talked with before, and basically just getting really quick learnings off of what we're doing. So again, the picture on the left is giving this product to a customer, having them use it, having them kind of talk out loud as they use it. We did a lot more interview observations there on the right. We have, with any kind of product like this, the whole village would come and see. So that's why there's basically a huge crowd here. But we actually leave the products with customers for weeks on end. So, it's not just us and them. They're hand-holding them through the products, but we actually wanted to understand how they use the products if we weren't looking over their shoulder. And so Simon here actually used this solar concentrator to charge, he set up a business charging cell phones, and it lasted for several months. This wooden prototype lasted for several months. He actually repaired it a couple times just because it was that valuable to him to keep using it. This was him showing us how it actually blew apart in the wind, and he re-drilled holes with no mechanical drills, just a knife, and put the prototype back together, which was really exciting for us because that's like proof right there that they value that product. We did a lot of, we gave these to customers, and where would you put this in your house? Show us how you install it. There's a lot of show us, because if it was just us sitting there and having them tell us how they install these products, it's very different. And again, more quick and dirty prototypes. We tried putting LED lights in the frame of a kerosene lantern. Because one of the things we were looking at is how can we not really change user behavior that much from what they're used to, but still get rid of kerosene. So it's kind of an interesting attempt. But so throughout this whole design process, and I'll get to the really exciting stuff, is where we've gotten now, but it's very back and forth. We've been through this for about 2 years now to get to a technology that we're deploying. Actually, I'm going to Tanzania next week to deploy this on a large scale for the first time. So again, it's persistence. You're not going to get it right the first time. These markets are really hard to work in, so you'll fail many times. And we look back at our early prototypes and we're like, what were we thinking? But of course, we had to go through the process to actually get to where we are. So where are we? I'll go ahead and pass this around. This is called the Angaza soul light. And what we really found in these markets is, I showed you that picture of Naomi studying by kerosene lantern. And it was really her and her 3 siblings studying around that one kerosene lantern. So we wanted to create an LED light that was bright enough for an entire family to share at one time. It wasn't just a desk lamp that one child could use, but because studying and reading and all these activities at night just required people to come together and then socialize, we wanted to create a ceiling-mounted room light that was dispersed enough to really cater to the whole family. And that product actually charges mobile phones as well. And again, we went through a couple iterations to add mobile charging there, which is much more valuable at times than even light. So we're actually selling this product in 6 countries now, manufacturing in China. We've had to kind of deal with all these problems about air shipping from China, which is extremely expensive, and working with local distributors and outfitting those local distributors with marketing and customer education material to be able to sell these products. And an interesting thing in this market is that there's been kind of unbranded, cheap Chinese imports in the solar space that have sort of infiltrated even the rural areas of East Africa. But they're very cheap. They break in a number of months. And customers who have bought and used those products have lost trust in solar because they associate those unbranded Chinese products, their track record with them as all of solar. Every solar product is as cheap as that. So one of the barriers we've had to overcome is how do we educate a customer that this is a high quality product, there's a warranty, if anything goes wrong with the product, they can take it back to the distributor where they bought it. And it's not just going to break in a couple of months and you'll lose your money. But we actually, so this is I don't know if anyone thinks in lumens, but it's a 200 lumen light, which is about 50 to 65 times brighter than kerosene. And because we've really pushed the limits on how bright this light can get, yeah, again, that number, the kerosene light has different settings on it, but a light like this at night is so much brighter than what they're used to. But the product is retailing for about $50, 50. And $50 for someone who has the unit economics, which I described before, is very expensive. They're oftentimes spending between $40 and $50 on a new cell phone, and they're doing that because they automatically understand the value that a cell phone brings to their life. But when it comes to a solar product, the sell is a lot harder because they've either been burned by the solar product, so they just don't immediately understand what a solar light brings to them. So we're selling this product for a couple months, and we took a step back and we said, we're going to only hit the very top percentage of those rural markets, those with more buying power, who can actually afford this product. Like how are we going to deal with that? And some companies deal with that by extending microfinance loans to the customer. For example, Cellco has a great ecosystem where they actually give loans to the customer to afford the down payment and then the payment of the product over time. But the problem with microfinance institutions is a lot of them are sort of nervous about getting into the consumer goods space, or the loan needed by one family to purchase this kind of product is too low. So we essentially wanted to create a microfinance solution in a very technological way. And what we did is called a Payasyougo technology. And what this means is we're offering to a customer the ability to buy this product at only $10 down payment instead of $50. And then they pay about $1 a week over time for about a year when the product unlocks and it's theirs to use permanently. So we call it a rent-to-own model. And we're doing this in a very hands-off, remotely activated sort of way because we don't want to be like a microfinance institution where we have to send collection agents to the rural areas, collect these micropayments each week, which can be very costly. And we wanted to basically take advantage of the cellular networks that exist throughout East Africa. So what we're doing is there's actually circuitry embedded within that light. So our light that we started out selling, the Soul Light, and our pay-as-you-go enabled Soul Light look exactly the same on the outside. But on the inside, there's circuitry that actually connects to the cellular network. And we can accept a mobile money payment from a user and then automatically activate their unit based on what they prepaid. And we track energy output of that product. We call it, they basically purchase a certain amount of energy credits, we track energy output, and once their prepaid energy credits have been used up, the light in the unit just switch off and don't function until they pay again. So it's sort of this cyclical nature where we're using a very technology-based approach to turn on and off the light based on whether they pay it a little bit over about a year's length of time. And if you go back to the unit economics of that customer's profile, by lowering that upfront cost from $50 to $10, we're opening the market to about 90% of the world market, where we estimated we were only being affordable to about 10% of the market at a $50 price point. So even that $40, taking $40 out of the upfront price was huge in opening up the customers that we could reach. And then, again, a 5-year cost of this kind of product, it's kind of the product that pays back very quickly. They only have to change the rechargeable battery in that unit once, so it equates to about a $75 over a 5-year period versus the $500 that they're currently spending on much more inferior kerosene lanterns and cell phone chargers. So these are some of our customer images of customers using the solar light in the field, and like I mentioned, we're actually going back out to Tanzania next week to do a large-scale rollout of this pay-as-you-go technology. And shameless plug, you should follow our blog at the bottom there, because we'll be posting daily a lot more stories of working with customers in the field and kind of taking readers through a journey of how we're deploying this. So that's about it for me. I think we might have time for questions or.
So Jim and Lesley, if you'll stay up here, we can open it up for Q&A. Questions? Comments?
I have a question for Lesley. A great presentation, but how do you get this to the market? I mean, you still got to have a point of sale someplace in here. Can you talk about that?
Great question. Distribution's kind of the nut to crack within these markets. And when we first started out, we thought that we could solve the distribution problem. So Angaza itself was trying to tackle both the R&D, the product development, the manufacturing, and the distribution. And it was way too much for us to tackle, and we just didn't have the expertise to really understand how these pretty unique distribution channels occurred in the market. So what we're doing now is we're actually aggregating local distributors. Many of them are NGOs who sell solar products. Some are actually microfinance institutions who have gotten into the sale of solar products. And we sell through wholesale distributors as well. So those are more traditional distributors, as you know, in the US, who sell to them smaller retail stores, or there's kind of 3 middlemen in that retail chain. But there's no one distribution method that works everywhere. So.
Thank you. I'm sure there are questions out there.
Yeah. In terms of maintenance, you showed that one example of the consumer fixing it himself. Is that what you rely on, or do you do any sort of maintenance? Or no?
No, we definitely work with our distributors to really so they can have the technical know-how if anything goes wrong to fix the products. But actually, one of the things with the pay-as-you-go technology we're working with is, because it's all regulated over the cellular network, we actually have the ability to get data back from each and every unit that's been deployed in the field. So we're tracking things like solar panel efficiency, battery capacity, number of hours of light used per night, and number of basically watt hours used to charge cell phones. So we're actually setting up this sort of remote customer support infrastructure where we can tell exactly how a unit's operating and then remotely help them. So if a solar panel is operating below an expected efficiency, we get that data point back, and then we can send an automatic SMS to our customer and say, hey, go clean up your solar panel, it's probably dirty. So we're taking certain steps like that to provide customer support, because oftentimes the distributor they buy it from isn't just right next door. They may have to take a bus and actually make a big trek to get out there.
Yeah, what were some of your biggest challenges with startup costs?
That has been our biggest challenge, especially as a physical product company. There's a lot of money that has to go into R&D, building physical prototypes, having basically manufacturing the tools in China to manufacture these in high volume. So it's not as easy as sort of an internet startup per se to prove out your model without money. So it's been one of our biggest challenges, and early stage capital for social ventures is pretty hard to come by because we're working in risky markets. A lot of investors don't really understand Africa. There's more growth stage capital out there for social ventures once they've kind of proved out a certain point. So we've actually taken a number of approaches. We've ended up raising money from a lot of different sources. So business plan competitions were extremely useful for us early on to get that early money to start our user research and prototype process. Some small scale angels, now we're getting into larger scale angels. And angels are great because they really connect on a personal level with our mission and what we're doing. Whereas venture capitalists in the Bay Area don't really understand what we're trying to do. So it's been one of our biggest challenges, and we've ended up having to be very creative about using a lot of different sources, which we may have even gotten only 3K to 75K from, but good question.
Other questions in the back there? Yes.
Yeah, what is the technology for getting that data back to your centralized source? Do you use the cell phone of the owner to link it back to the cell system, or you don't have a connection directly from your device to the cell system, do you?
Yeah, so we're actually using the cell phone of the owner. And then we have a whole back-end software platform that lives in the cloud that's regulating both incoming payments, incoming data, and outgoing activation codes to each unit. So one of the beauties of our Payasyougo technology is it's adding only $1 to the overall product cost to be able to do this. If you were to embed a GSM module directly into the product, that's adding $17 right off the bat just for the GSM module, which kind of goes against the whole concept of extreme affordability. So by us actually pairing with the customer's cell phone, we can get that cost down to about $1 and still have the same functionality.
Just it occurred to me, and Andy, come to you next and then here in the front, but it occurred to me that we recently had an estimate to do solar panels on our home, and maintenance is an important factor that and it seemed to me that your technology, your solution could actually be applied here, would help these solar home installations here as a way to monitor and know when it's time to get up and whatever you do, brush those off or brush them off.
We've actually had U.S. solar companies approach us and say, how can we apply this to the U.S.? And I think there's actually a lot of examples of things happening in the developing world that the U.S. is trying to grab hold of and use. And mobile money is a big example of that too.
Just charge them a lot when they're
Yeah.
Andy?
So I just wanted to ask what you're thinking about all this data you're collecting. Are there ways you can monetize this either for carbon credits or advertising or other ways that could help your company?
Yeah, and we're looking at it both internally and externally about how to make this an extra revenue stream as well. So we're definitely looking into carbon credits. The fact that we can show with these data points that our unit is still operating in the field is pretty huge for carbon credits. Because the big thing you have to get over with carbon credits is actually proving the customer is still using the product and it's still replacing carbon. Yeah, so.
There's a question right down here too.
In the case of where they're paying incrementally to activate the device, what happens if their cell phone runs out of batteries before they can make a payment?
Yeah.
Charge it with the device.
It's a great question, and something we're trying to figure out now. We actually are building in like an emergency power mode that'll give like a surge of energy so they can use their cell phone to do it. We're trying to think of all the worst case scenarios, what if, and dealing with this.
The carbon credits, where are you looking to sell those?
Great question. We're actually going through a number of NGOs who have either set up pretty large carbon credit infrastructure around clean cook stoves and trying to bring them into the distributed solar space as well with what they've learned off that. So, us, Angaza as a company, we're not dealing a lot with that. We're kind of letting a third party do that and use our products as sort of the vehicle for that.
I actually gave a talk at the World Bank a few years ago. I think I've kept it. They gave me 5 tons of carbon credits, or it's a certificate for the talk. I don't know what that's worth. I hope I can monetize it somewhere. But actually, it's a certificate for carbon credits for the talk. Other questions? These are great questions. Yes, down here.
I was just wondering about when you market the ones that are pay-as-you-go, is there any kind of like bad PR that this is a device that will shut off and not work? Because you said that, you know, there's kind of a bad name for solar products that don't work.
Right. And one of the, we don't want to be in a situation where a customer, like, it shuts off because they haven't paid and they're just completely frustrated with the product. They're like, you know, this is a piece of crap, like, let me, you know, buy a better brand or a better product. So we're doing various design aspects like putting in an energy credit indicator as well as battery indicator, so they can know, okay, is their battery dead? Do they need to charge it longer, or do they need to pay more money to top up the product? And a lot comes down to just customer education at that initial sale. Like, do they understand how this process is working, and can they keep that up, you know, through a lucid year?
And then here, another question.
Yeah, and this might apply to both of you guys, particularly house power systems or whatever. But I'm wondering, so you provide these services for the basic pyramid, and you get they get one or two lights to provide a very minimal amount of energy. I mean, by our standards or whatever. So I guess my question is, have you guys started thinking about what the next step is? You know, like what other applications you can use this electricity for, and also how do you stick with the whole mission of making it sustainable and prevent? I mean, once these people sort of have this built up access to power or one or two lights or whatever, how do you prevent them from then all of a sudden attaching to the grid and sort of running into the same problems that we are in the United States with not being able to integrate sustainable energy into their houses? How do you prevent them from just once now that they've gotten out of the bottom of the pyramid, how do you prevent them from just setting up coal power plants or anything? What's I guess the very long term future goals of either of your organizations?
Do you want to answer, Joe?
It's a wonderful question, and there actually is interesting research on, what we're really talking about is latent demand. There's a need that exists there, but with energy, once you have energy, you want more. So it's not just the light, it's charging the cell phone, it's a radio, it's a black and white, maybe color television, and wouldn't refrigeration be cool? No pun intended. That came out. Anyway, but because of food perishing, I mean, it's in terms of economic value, tremendous value, and then mechanization, running water pumps to irrigate your 1 acre, 1 hectare farm, and so forth. So there is some interesting research, and what's interesting thing is also there's a nice tight correlation between energy consumption, access to energy, and per capita GDP growth. They're very highly correlated. And so what happens is with energy, you improve education, you improve health. If you improve health, you improve amount of time people can work. People can produce, a lot of people make their living good. Artists, skilled artists and handicraft kind of work. If you could do an extra couple of hours a day, et cetera. So the story here is one of it. This is a market that once it starts to take root, will grow. It's going to grow organically, just like all the apps that happen on the iPhone and the cell phone. So you think of it, I think of it as a development platform. We think of like technology platforms. This is a development platform because it has all these corollary effects. And if you do research papers on this, you find, I think, some interesting things there. But so House Power is selling for compact fluorescent lights. They're selling LEDs. And you make me aware of some other things as you visited there. But once you establish also the channel is really valuable because it didn't exist before. So all of a sudden, there are all kinds of complementary products that you potentially could use. So the channel is so expensive to create that now we can amortize the cost over a wider range of products. It's a wonderful question, but you probably thought about that as well.
Yeah, one of the things that's really effective for the distributed solar home systems is using a smaller 1 or 2 watt product as sort of the entry-level product to get the customer's trust in solar and the brands and just understanding what LED light is. And then having upgrade products that a customer can then move to. So 5, 10 watt, 15 watt after that, which will run multiple lights and provide energy for different uses too. So by coming in to the markets with an entry-level product and then giving the customer the channel to upgrade after that is pretty effective.
You know, another thing, you saw that one slide that I hadn't seen that one before, let's say of the solar home installation, the 12 and 6 volt batteries and the wiring hanging and so forth, and you think, oh, this looks really like a kludge together, you know, Rube Goldberg solution. Guess what? That's how computers started out too, many years ago. And so what's happening in any modular technology, study the history of technology and science, anything that's modularized creates opportunity for specialization. So we're starting to see significant improvements in batteries, inverter battery combinations, wiring, LEDs, et cetera, et cetera. So you start to see a whole set of complementary technologies, and innovation builds on innovation. That's how. So ultimately, this could be very disruptive. Why would you want to string all these transmission lines to a lot of places on the planet? You know, does that really make sense to do that? And if any of you have electrical background, you know there's line loss and so forth, and energy when you transmit at great distances. So the economics here potentially could be overwhelmingly interesting over time. Maybe we should have a microgrid. Maybe we should have your lines right here.
And there's really very few government initiatives that are actually trying to expand the grid at all. So it's sort of like what happened with cell phones is landlines never exist there, they went straight to mobile phones. Same thing I think is happening with energy.
There's another one. These are great questions, by the way. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, what is like that little modular computer, what's your distribution system for it? Like how do you get it out there?
Yeah.
You might need to repeat that one.
What? Yeah. Shameless plug for Cellco. So we sell through a variety of channels. NGOs are our most effective channel because they actually have a rural presence, and oftentimes they actually employ local entrepreneurs with a business in a bag model to actually go door to door and sell solar products like this. So one of our best distribution partners is called Solar Sister in Uganda. They're also a GSBI graduate from this past summer. Shameless plug for Solar Sister, they're awesome. And they have a network of, I think it's 150 women entrepreneurs now, which are trained in the solar products. They're trained in kind of basic sales and marketing, and they go door to door and sell products like this. So that's our favorite form of distribution, which really gets to the customers that we're targeting. But we're also using more traditional channels like small retail stores.
Yes, yeah.
So you're based in the United States, and I assume there's a language barrier having to do with, you're talking about very personalized service. Is using that Solar Sisters a really good partnership to fix that? I mean, is that your main?
Yeah, absolutely. We really rely on all of our local partners to kind of get across that gap. And as a product development company, the best place for us to be is in Silicon Valley, where we have all those resources. We're manufacturing in China too, so we kind of have this like global triangle going on with sales in East Africa. But we absolutely rely on all of our local partners to make this work.
I'm watching we have a timekeeper down here, so Keith will bring the hook.
We have time. Go ahead, Scott.
Go ahead.
What constitutes the majority of your manufacturing costs?
The battery is very expensive. Solar panel and LEDs are, I mean, we're using very highly efficient LEDs, and so we've chosen certain components based on their efficiency to maximize like light output, for example. So you can get LEDs that are much cheaper than the ones we're using, but we've chosen those LEDs specifically. So essentially the solar panel, the battery, and the LEDs.
Down here. Yeah.
If you said this, what's your profit margin, including distribution costs on a battery?
Right now it's pretty bad because we're shipping a lot air freight, which adds about, if we're lucky, $8 to the cost of the unit. It's exorbitant, yeah. Shipping by ocean will get it down to about $2 a unit. So right now it costs us about $25 to manufacture our product, and we're selling this one for a retail price of $50, which you tack on all the margins for distributors in there, and Solar Sister, for example, gives each entrepreneur that sells a product a 15% margin. So it very quickly adds up all the costs that are going to the middleman in the distribution chain as well. And that's actually, in terms of a business model, one of the things we're really trying to push with our Payasyougo system is we're charging the customer less per week, but they're actually paying a greater amount over time for the same product with the same functionality. We're doing that because it allows us to operate on higher margins, which is absolutely essential for a for-profit company like us to do. And it also is dealing with the risk profile of us selling the product below cost and making it up over time.
Are there, follow-up questions, a great question, are there economies of scale, does it get cheaper if it gets to 10,000?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's another challenge we're dealing with is trying to get enough customer orders to, and balance the financing that we have to actually build our next high volume batch products.
That was kind of my question. What are you're going to roll them out next week or something? How many units are you talking about?
We're doing 100 for our pay-as-you-go deployment. And we're actually scaling that pretty quickly, so we already have a project for 1,000 happening in July. So it's a very quick turnaround from us trying to understand a lot of the remaining questions we have around pricing and customer education, and then manufacturing that in high volume very quickly.
Over here, yes.
I was wondering about the level of interplay between like the solar decathlon we do on campus and the GSVI and all their solar initiatives. Like, is it like the standard in 10, 20, 30 years that we're going to have, you know, like a developed country, fully functional solar house for everybody, or like how does that work?
I think that's something you should do. I think you should form a committee. No, I'm teasing you. I think that's
Solar decathlon for the developing world.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea.
Sam,
I bet Keith would be an angel investor. No, that is really, isn't that a neat idea? Just to think of what would be possible. To take all the best of breed thinking that's coming out of this kind of work and use it. Because how big are these houses that are a typical house?
Small, parking maybe one room, 1 or 2 rooms.
So you're like in like the whole house and you know, one of the things I was thinking is interesting, I wanted to ask you, what it made me think about your question, made me think about this is, because I'm sorry if I sound being facetious because we're not doing that now, but it's a really neat idea. But in the work in this area, do you think that on a price performance basis, things are continuing to improve? And how do you compare yourself with, say, D-Light? How if you were to, you know, on a price performance basis, D-Light has had a lot of visibility in terms of lumens and cost per lumen and stuff. Are there benchmarks like that?
Yeah, definitely. It's a question we get very often too, because D-Light also came out of Stanford in the Bay Area. So if you look at just a technical performance level, our light is selling for around the same price, and it's twice as bright as D-Light's S250, which is kind of their upper tier product. But companies like D-Light, Barefoot Power, they have a problem. Back to the question over here, is that they're operating under very slim product margins. So, for example, their very small desk light, the S1, it's a great product for a child and to really promote education. But distributors are making maybe $1 off of that product. It sells for a retail price of $10, so you can do the math there. And it really relies on companies having to push a large volume of products to make up for these very slim product margins. And in the markets we're working in, distribution is very fragmented, so it's very hard to push that large volume of products. So that's another reason that we really switched over to this pay-as-you-go focus, both to handle issues like the business model that D-Light's struggling with, and be able to provide these higher quality products that don't require just stripping out functionality from the product to lower that cost.
How often do you have to replace the batteries?
Once every 2 to 3 years.
Any final questions? Thank you.